Please join me in giving a warm Rotary welcome to my colleague and friend, Mr. Doug Shipman.
You get an introduction like that and you say, who are you talking about? That was very, very kind. And let me just start by saying that I'm very excited to be here today. And I'm very excited to be invited by my friend Todd Gross, who is doing such great work around the state. The Georgia Historical Society is an incredibly relevant statewide institution for storytelling, for preservation, and for understanding how we take history and we tell it to those who did not live through it. Because that's when history really comes alive, when somebody who doesn't remember it takes notice and puts it to work in their life. And Todd, you do great work, and I'm so glad that we're working together. Let me also say, just to my friend from Framingham, Massachusetts, I used to live in West Newton when I went to Harvard, which is just a stone's throw away from Framingham. It's a lovely place. I'm so glad you're here. Let me start actually with that number 50 years. It's interesting that you mentioned 50 years because as I think about the work that we're doing, and I'll get to the center and what it is in a minute. But when I think about the work that we're doing, 50 years is a very important number in my memory. 1995 marked the 50-year anniversary of the end of World War II. VE, VJ days were celebrated, and then an interesting series of things began to occur. 1996, the Holocaust Memorial Museum opens in Washington, D.C. 1998, the film Saving Private Ryan is produced by Steven Spielberg, is a huge hit and becomes a linchpin for the new understanding of World War II. The Band of Brothers, Stephen Ambrose's book, and then films come out in 2001. The Mall on Washington sees the World War II memorial constructed. Tom Brokaw writes his book about the Greatest Generation in the early 2000s, which begins to reinterpret how we understand the Vietnam era and beyond through the lens of the World War II generation. All of that happened immediately after the 50-year anniversary. Why? Because at 50 years, something very interesting happens with history. We either decide that it is interesting and everybody who lived through it should be celebrated one more time, and then we sort of put it up on the shelf, or we begin to reinterpret it because we think it has something to tell us about today, and we think that those who did not live through it should have some way, some avenue into it. Steven Spielberg using young actors, Stephen Ambrose, Band of Brothers, again, putting young faces around old histories, so it looks like a much more contemporary picture. World War II was deemed to be worthy of revisiting. We are exactly at 50 years when it comes to the civil rights legacy. Last year, as many of you know, was the 50th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech. This year is the anniversary of the '64 Civil Rights Act and, of course, Freedom Summer. Next year is 1965, so it's Bloody Sunday, Selma and Montgomery March, the Voting Rights Act, and then we will go through 2018 and the assassination of Dr. King and what many popular historians call the end of the Civil Rights Movement. So we're right at this moment where we either decide we will celebrate the icons one more time and we will dismiss that history to the past, or we will reinterpret it for the future. This institution that I've been working on for 7 years is full-throated in making the case that the civil rights legacy is relevant for going forward, even more so than it has been as a historical landmark. And let me give you a couple of reasons why I think that that is. I want you, if you're in this room, to raise your hand if you were born after 1973. Raise your hand. Raise it high, don't be shy. 1973. I'm in that category. I have some good news and some bad news. The good news and the bad news is that those born after 1973 are the vast majority of Americans today. The vast majority of Americans were born after 1973. The vast, vast majority of the world was born after 1973. In fact, most of the world in the developing world was actually born after 1980. Now, why does that matter? Those of us who were born after 1973, we have no memory of the 60s. Now, many of you who lived through the 60s have no memory of the 60s either. That is a completely different speech, okay? But we have no memory of the 60s. And that means that when we look at this history, we don't remember segregation. We don't remember colored bathrooms and white bathrooms. We don't remember a time in which African Americans couldn't vote. In fact, the closer and closer you get to the present, you get to stats like this. Freshmen entering college this fall. How many of you may have a freshman who's entering college this fall? Freshmen entering college this fall were 6 years old on 9/11. Within 2 or 3 years, no freshman entering college will actually remember 9/11. That will be their history, let alone the I Have a Dream speech or the Civil Rights era. There are less than 25% of Americans who can actually possibly remember the I Have a Dream speech when it actually happened. They either weren't alive yet or they were too young. I did the math. Here's the second thing that's important about those born after 1970. You see, what happens when the civil rights movement ends is other social movements begin as well. Farm workers movement, which becomes the Latino movement, the gay rights movement starting at Stonewall in the late 60s becomes the gay rights movement, the second women's movement. And so anybody born after 1970 has a completely different conception of this world in which we live, but a conception that can be very insightfully influenced by remembering the civil rights era. Now here's an even more stark reality. I want you to think about your family reunion. Now the extended family reunion, the cousins and the uncles. And if your family doesn't get along well enough to actually have a family reunion, then imagine it if it did happen. All right? Now I want you to raise your hand and leave it up for just a minute. If there would be somebody in your family who didn't look like everybody else, either because of marriage or adoption. If you're primarily a white family, you would have somebody African American. If you're primarily Jewish family, you have somebody non-Jewish. Raise your hand if you have somebody else in the family. Raise them up high. I want you to look around this room. It's at least 50%. No matter what room I'm in, it's at least 50%. I've been in all African American rooms, all Jewish rooms, all old rooms, all Indian rooms, all white rooms, doesn't matter. It's at least 50%. Do you know why? 1 in 7 marriages in 2010 were interracial. 1 in 7. And that's not a Jew and a Catholic, because I looked at those numbers too. I promise you, I'm big on data. That is a Latino person and an Asian person. That's an African American person and a white person. 1 in 7. The number of people raising their hand who will have somebody in the family who doesn't look like the family will be close to 100% in about 10 or 15 years. It's just math because of the way that families work. So when you think about those of us born after 1970, or those of us born after 1980, or those of us born after 1990, or even 2000, whose first president will be someone who's brown. Now think about that for a minute. Think about somebody whose first memory of a president is President Obama. Forget your politics. Just think about if you try to explain to them what Martin Luther King was talking about when the most powerful person in the world, the first one they've ever seen is a brown dude. It doesn't make any sense to them unless we reframe these stories in ways that relate to the reality that they live in. Here's the other reason why this legacy makes so much difference. We invited somebody over who was one of the architects of Tahrir Square, the Egyptian uprising a couple of years ago that overthrew Mubarak. He said, I studied the civil rights history before our movement started. For 2 years, I looked at movements around the world, and I studied the American civil rights movement for how it worked and the tactics. And in fact, when we were in Tahrir Square, we had signs in Arabic, and you know what they said? I am a man. Those of you who know your civil rights history know that those are the same signs that the sanitation workers were using in Memphis when King was shot. I am a man. It's a very famous, iconic sign, but they were writing it in Arabic. They were singing, we shall overcome, arm in arm, on the streets of Cairo. Of all the things they could have sung, of all the songs, they picked that one. There's a group of women who are trying to gain the right to drive in Saudi Arabia right now. Women can't drive in Saudi Arabia, some of you know, by themselves. So these women have basically been going out on Sunday afternoons and driving and taking YouTube videos of themselves driving and posting them up as protests to try to gain the right to drive in Saudi Arabia. Do you know what the Saudi Arabian press calls them? Freedom riders. Saudi Arabia. Of all the things that they could note, they call them the Freedom Riders. Why? This legacy is so much bigger than most of us realize, and so many people want to tap into it, whether they be in Syria or in Saudi Arabia or across the street, or whether they be a 17-year-old. This legacy matters to them, and it's something that has so much drama and so much insight for the changing America that I believe we have the ability to put it forward again. Here's the other thing that's interesting. Every year, the Georgia Council for International Visitors works with the State Department. And the State Department sponsors people from around the world to come to the United States for 3 or 4 weeks and meet with civic and government officials in 2 or 3 different cities and then go back home. Georgia is almost always on their itinerary when they're coming from a country that's dealing with some sort of political or social conflict. I have met with folks from Afghanistan, from East Timor. I met with a delegation that included somebody from Libya about 2 months after the government there had fallen. We hosted folks last year from the Middle East. These are all folks who are working to gain liberty in those countries. They usually go to Washington, D.C., they go to either New York or Los Angeles, and they come to Georgia, typically to Atlanta, but sometimes Atlanta and Savannah, because they want to tap into this legacy. They say there's nothing more powerful that we can tap into than the American Civil Rights legacy, and how you did it, and how you did it relatively peacefully, and how everybody participated. That's what we're trying to do in our countries. And so all of this that we're working on is a backdrop to try to liberate, in some ways, this history from just being a Southern story, just being an African American story, just being a 1950s and 60s story, and instead putting it on the same level as the Founding Fathers, Lincoln, World War II, and this legacy, so that every young person can pull from it. So how do you do that? How do you actually do that? Well, it's helpful if you have a place, and this is the place that we're building, if you can see the screen. This is the Center for Civil and Human Rights, which will open in a few weeks. It is a 3-story building that has 3 major exhibitions. One, as Todd mentioned, the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers collection. A few years ago, the city of Atlanta came together and bought a 50,000 document collection of Dr. King's papers, everything from his handwritten Nobel Peace Prize speech to his grad school report card. Some of you may know he went to Crozer Theological Seminary and got a C+ in public speaking. True story. King was not a natural speaker. He had to work extremely hard at it. In fact, if you ask King, he would have said, "I'm a writer who learned how to speak and how to preach." So we will display those papers in rotation. We will have a whole series of galleries about civil rights history, but the civil rights stories are told aimed at those who have no memory of them. We actually got a guy named George C. Wolfe, who's a Broadway director and filmmaker, to be the one to design those galleries so that someone born long after the history can find a way into it, much like those of you, if you've gone to the Holocaust Memorial Museum. Interesting tidbit, when the Holocaust Memorial, how many of you have been to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C.? Yeah, a lot of us have. When they first opened, they were 85% Jewish in their visitation. Now they're less than 10% Jewish in their visitation. They have consistently found ways to invite people in to experience them with meaning that are not connected to that history specifically. We want to do the same thing in our civil rights galleries. And then a series of human rights galleries, which will ever change based on what's happening around the world today. So for instance, the Sochi Olympics just happened. There were a lot of human rights issues around the Sochi Olympics. We would have had an exhibition around Sochi. Through our technology and through our changing exhibitions, we would be talking about Sochi and human rights. If we were open right now, and in fact we probably will, because it'll continue what's happening in the Ukraine and Crimea and the human rights issues that are involved there, because it's not just what you see politically, but there are also religious human rights issues involved there. So we'll have 3 major exhibitions at any one time to invite people into both a historical view and also a contemporary view around these issues. This just shows you the campus that we're on. That's us in the foreground. To the left is the World of Coca-Cola. Up above is a parking deck, and just behind that is the Georgia Aquarium. So we will sit right in the middle of the tourist area of Atlanta, next to Centennial Olympic Park, and just down the street from the Georgia World Congress Center. So what we're finding is that for many, this is the front door into Georgia and into this legacy, because they're coming for a convention, or they're coming for a conference, or they're coming to visit one of the universities, and they're going to see this as a way to understand why this history is important and how it applies to them. That land was donated by Coca-Cola for us, and an interesting tidbit, Neville Isdell, who was the CEO at the time, was the one who drove the donation. He actually grew up in Zimbabwe, went to college in South Africa, and was part of the anti-apartheid protests in South Africa when he was a student, actually spent time in jail. So for him, this donation was actually going back to his student days and something that he had worked on. This is a picture of the King Papers Gallery. We will rotate through the King Papers every 4 months so that you will always have a new and updated exhibition of the King Papers. As you can see, there are inscriptions of King's quotes on the wall. That's Southern pine to evoke the Southern church the wood you often see in Southern churches. 2 interesting tidbits here in this gallery. One, we will have fewer than more items on display, because we want people to actually spend some time with the items instead of being overwhelmed. And 2, what you won't hear in this gallery is King's voice. You will hear King's voice in a lot of the other galleries, but here we wanted you to contemplate King the writer, King the thinker, as opposed to King the speaker. And so actually this will be a quiet room, much like when you visit the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence at the National Archives. It'll be a chance to actually understand these documents, and thankfully King had tremendous handwriting, so you can actually read the documents in his own hand. Todd and I were just commenting how the early signers of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution and such had tremendous handwriting. King was in the same legacy. This is actually the ending of the exhibit. This is called Shared Accomplishments. We actually wanted to knit together physically that civil and human rights are all part of the same story, so each of those exhibits ends in the same room, which is called Shared Accomplishments. It's a 360-degree room with floor-to-ceiling televisions where we will showcase pictures that link past and present around civil and human rights. So folks arm in arm, folks singing the same songs, folks celebrating in the same ways. But this gallery can also be changed in real time to reflect what's going on. So for instance, when Mandela passed away, we could turn this entire gallery into a live feed of the Mandela funeral and have our docents talking about the legacy of Mandela in that space so that visitors will feel as if they're real time reflecting what's happening in the world. This is an interesting exhibit. Part of what we're trying to do is not only tell big stories, but to tell very specific personal stories. This is called Who Like Me. These are mirrors that are in a room. So imagine walking in, there are a series of mirrors, you're seeing your own reflection, maybe who you're there with visiting that day. And as you get close to the mirror, words start to float out of the mirror. And the words would be things like Christian, journalist, parent, Jew, Muslim, white, black. And you start to push the words that apply to you. And out will come an individual, a real person who we have filmed, who will tell you their story. And you will see that they're facing a human rights issue where they live based on the same characteristics that you share. And we believe that no matter who you are and what you punch in, that you will see a real person come out of that screen who shares something with you, including somebody asked me the other day, they said, well, I'm a white guy from Tifton. Who's going to come out of the screen for me? And I said a white Zimbabwe farmer who lost his multi-family generational farm in Zimbabwe when the government changed and all the whites were kicked off their land, and not only kicked off their land, but he actually lost his citizenship in his home country that he had been a countryman of for 4 generations. We are showcasing how these are universal stories. No matter who you are or how you worship or what you look like, you could face a human rights issue someplace in the world. And so it's a personal way for you to connect with these issues. These are our human rights galleries. As you see, there's a big map. We have very large interactive tables. So part of what we offer is that visitors can define the issues that they're interested in and go deeply on them. So there are 3 tables in the back of that gallery where a number of people can gather around a table and go deeply on an issue. And they can explore that issue, films, they can send themselves emails about the issue, then they can find another issue. Those can be updated in real time. And there's also a ticker above that map that shows human rights issues in real time so that people can go in and they can find the things they care most about and explore them. Or a classroom of students can come in and the teacher can say, we want to really talk about this issue today, we want to talk about that issue today, and they can find those on those tables. This is a picture of the overall plan for the center, which is a 3-phased approach. What's in the middle is what we're building right now. On either side, we think that 3 to 5 years from now we'll be expanding. One will be additional exhibition space and one will be additional auditorium space. I didn't show a picture, but in addition to the galleries, we also have 2 other interesting things. One's a broadcast facility where we can actually do live or taped television or audio broadcasts, because we think that there'll be a lot of distance learning and also media opportunities for which we can have a professor from a certain institution, or we can have somebody like Todd come up and talk from our studio and be interviewed and also do oral histories or other types of media efforts. And the other is we have an event space that can seat about 125 for a dinner, about 225 for a lecture. So we'll be having events in our space. We'll be hosting all kinds of conferences, book tours, films, etc. And one thing that I've just noted on this that's interesting that we didn't realize, there's an enormous appetite in the corporate world to talk about these issues, especially companies that work across countries, and they may face different ethical issues in certain countries, different labor issues in certain countries, but they're scared to talk about these issues in public, because obviously the risk of talking about that in public and the criticism that could follow could be quite damaging. They actually have been calling us and saying, can we work with you for us to bring our senior corporate leaders to your facility to have a 2-day internal discussion around these issues. And I keep saying, why are you calling us? You could do this at a hotel, you could do this on your corporate campus, you could do this at a university. They said, because Atlanta's legacy of the business community being positive when it came to social change gives us a sense that there's something there we can learn from as to how business can actually have a positive role when it comes to human rights and freedom and liberty. And we've said, yeah, that's actually what we want to be hosting. And so in addition to all the public things we'll do, there's an enormous amount of business interest in combining with us. I'll give you one example. Just even ahead of us opening, I was invited to a multinational company, one of the largest 50 companies in the world, to meet with their energy division. These are folks that build big transmission lines and energy generation plants and such. And they wanted me to facilitate a conversation about human rights around the world because they work in lots of countries with human rights issues. So we're having a conversation, and I'm facilitating the conversation, and the head of the unit, it's about an $8 billion unit, says, we treat every worker in our company around the world exactly the same way. If you work in Zimbabwe, if you work in Germany, if you work in Canada, you work in the US, you're treated the same way. And one of his subordinates, the head of global labor, raised his hand and said, sir, actually, that's not the truth. He said, what do you mean it's not the truth? He said, well, we have a minimum standard around the world. But there are standards in certain countries that are well above. He said, what we do in Germany is very different than what we do in Zimbabwe. There's a minimum standard, but we don't treat everybody exactly the same. And it launched a 30-minute discussion on whether or not that was right. Now, they have to make that decision for themselves, but I think there's something unique about this legacy that unlocks that kind of question, that allows that kind of question to be contemplated. And so in addition to the 400,000 people that are going to come here every year, and the millions more that are going to see us online, there are also going to be people who do work here, who have conversations here, who contemplate issues here that I think are going to have far-reaching implications. And so let me just close by saying, so I can have just a few minutes for questions, that in my mind, as somebody who is 41 and white and born in the South, to me, this is Georgia's calling card to the global conversation of freedom. This is why we get to have people from around the world come and say, we're trying to change our country, help us do it, because of this legacy of the American Civil Rights Movement and what Georgia represented. And I think as we unlock it, we will see that it has tremendous potential for us to bring freedom around the world and for us to help those who are trying to bring freedom to their countries and in their villages, wherever they may be. And so I'm excited about what we're doing. I invite you all to come and see us after we open in May, or to use us for your event, or to partner with us for your initiative. We see this as something that's not only about what we do, but also about what others do in partnership with us, like the Georgia Historical Society. So thank you for letting me be here today to share a little bit of the vision. I'd be happy to answer questions.